Okay, folks, let's finish up chapter 14, which is late medieval Italy. And we had already looked at in the previous video the Duecento, which is the 13th century, so from 12,000 to 12,099 CE. And now we're going to move into the Trecento, which is the 14th century, which is 13,000 to 1399 CE. And we left off with the Cimabue, Madonna enthroned with angels, figure 14.6. Now we're going to move into this 14th century period, and we're going to look at Giotto. We're going to start with Giotto and discuss his Arena Chapel and the Lamentation, in particular the fresco, which is going to be a new style of painting during this time that's going to transition into the Renaissance quite heavily with Leonardo as well as with Raphael during the High Renaissance and even prior to. And then we're going to look at the Orvieto Cathedral and then Lorenzetti's frescoes. And then if we get time, we'll get into Treni's Triumph of Death. Okay, so let's begin. And that is going to be figure 14.9, which is Giotto. And this is the interior of the Arena Chapel. And if you remember, when we looked back at the Byzantine icon paintings, I talked about how when some of the Byzantinum icon painters went west, which is what's happening here during this time, they transferred the idea of the ambient gold background, which is supposed to be kind of the spiritual existence, a spiritual ambience and atmosphere, to more of this blue, this kind of aquamarine, very rich sapphire-like blue. And we're seeing that here with figure 14.9 from Giotto. And you can see the Arena Chapel has this casting barrel vaulted tunnel ceiling that is all casted in blue. And when you look at Giotto's piece, I want you to consider how this will influence Michelangelo with his Sistine Chapel. And we'll be able to talk about that more thoroughly in Art History 142 if you choose to take that class. And we'll see how this has actually influenced Michelangelo 200 plus years prior to his Sistine Chapel. So what we have here is a mural. This is a mural, and it's a mural cycle of about 4 different components. You have the barrel vault on the top, you have the murals on the side, and again, these are all biblical Orthodox Christian themes and discussions that are occurring throughout this chapel. And then you have up where the apse is, right, which is the place of worship, all the way to the far distance of this image. So you have 4 main areas. You have a ceiling, which is more atmospheric, more cosmic, but there's still little pockets of circular narration coming from the Bible, as well as your adjacent walls running in parallel have biblical tales, as well as all the way back recessed with that barrel vault system. Know that this is a barrel vault chapel. It's running with one nave. There's no narthex, there's no entry, there's no special ornamentation that makes the chapel expansive in nature. It's very austere and simplistic, but it's still that channel barrel vault nave that runs to the apse, which is all the way in the far distance of this image. It was built by a wealthy banker to help offset his sins of usury. So he felt repentant in all of the use of money and commerce that he accrued and exchanged throughout his life. So this chapel is to show his devotion to God at the end of his life. So that's how he had it built. The southern 6 windows illuminate nearly all 38 panels. So on the southern side of this chapel will be, again, that emphasis on illumination, which we talked about earlier during the Duecento period, and also prior to, in chapter 13, the use of stained glass. In this case, they're just windows, but they are illuminating this small chapel and giving light casted upon all of these 38 panels. Okay, so 38 biblical panels in particular. And I want you to be able to know that, remember, we're coming out of this Romanesque period where we're starting to slowly look back at Roman art, and then we're going to start, then we're in, with the Renaissance and Proto-Renaissance, we're going to start looking back in Greek and Roman art. So that's going to be called Greco-Roman. But right now, we're just focusing on coming out of this Romanesque period, which is a emphasis on the Roman art. And what is emphasized here with the painterly aspect, with the painting, is fourth style painting. So if you remember in chapter 7, there were 4 different styles, and the fourth style was a composite of all the other 3 styles. So you had simplicity, you had imagery and narration of figures, and atmospheric in nature, and you also had the illusion of painting architecture and how it feeds into the actual architecture of the building. So Giotto is doing that. He's doing that fourth style. So he's kind of imitating that system. And one specific well, one thing I do want to say is that it is like the fourth style, but if you remember the fourth style, it was kind of fragmented and disjointed. You didn't know when you were looking at an image if it connected to the other. But in this case, all the biblical tales are in these registers that are sequential in nature, and it's all relatable. So it's not fragmented like the fourth style. It's kind of like a fifth style, if you will, or his own style. He did do the imitation marble veneer like the first style that we talked about all the way in chapter 7. So kind of be able to ultimately compare how Giotto's interior of the Arena Chapel relates back to that 7th chapter of the Roman art. So one thing is that the banker is seen in the Last Judgment kneeling to offer chapel to Mary and looking for forgiveness. So and what's really important about this is it's present here. Let's see, let me find that image. Anyway, I'll find it here in just a second. But what's really important about the fact that the patron is included in this mural is that this is going to be something very common in the Proto-Renaissance and the Renaissance period, is that the patron is going to be painted into the biblical imagery. Then again, instead of it being like during the Byzantine time where they would don purple or gold clothing to emphasize their connection to the biblical stories of Jesus and Mary, now they're actually going to be painted in. So so it's a precursor. So by seeing this wealthy banker inside of Giotto's paintings, and in particular the Last Judgment where he's kneeling in front of Mary, it's a precursor to what they're going to be doing as we move into the Proto-Renaissance and moving away from the medieval period. And again, the use of the heavily blue ceiling unifies all the panels by being in the backdrop. So if you look at, again, figure 14.9, I'm trying to get an overall broad picture of what's going on here before we look at some of the specific panels. You can see that the panels have that blue in the background based off of each little square of imagery coming from the Bible. And then there's the overall barrel arch of the blue atmosphere up at the top of the chapel, but then in each little depiction, biblical depiction, in each little panel there's also the blue background, so it unifies the whole entire space. So be able to see how he intentionally did that. Instead of changing the background in each depicted biblical story, he keeps the same coloration as the atmosphere, which is something that's very new to this time. He was very interested in more of depicting the physical world versus the spiritual. Again, that is his interest of using the blue instead of using the gold as the background. And this again is going to be a precursor to focusing on naturalism versus that of spirituality in regards to these paintings. All right, and that's going to be picked up and moved forward even more and more as we move into the late 14th century and early 15th century and even into the 16th century. Um, so let's look at one of them. Let's start with Lamentation. Okay? And if you look at Lamentation, you can see that there is an attempt to create some level of perspective or distance or depth, which is something that was going away during the medieval time. And now what Giotto is doing is he's creating three planes. He has a foreground, which is where the lamentation is happening, with the collection of Jesus' body, and then all of his followers and disciples shedding tear and being upset. And then you have the middle ground, which is actually this cliffside with this little tree sitting up on the top. And he's balancing out the activity of Jesus being held and cradled after the crucifixion by that little tree in the top right corner. Okay, so it's balancing out and it's symbolic too, in that the tree in the top right corner is this dead body, but there's still a presence to it, almost like there's a spiritual presence, even whenever the body comes to perish. So it's balancing out the activity of the lamentation down in the bottom left with the top right, which is this dormant tree, if you will. If you think about it, we don't really get that in Yuma, but a tree that goes dormant during winter is not dead, it's just quiet, and it's not growing, and it's waiting until spring to come back. So this lamentation is a biblical story of that dormancy before Jesus comes back, all right, and is resurrected, and he comes back after being entombed. So it's an intentional choice of having this tree kind of balance out not only the perspective visually, but also the story itself. And then the third is the background, which is the angels. They look a little flat and clustered because they're not overlapping one another. But if you notice that some of their bodies are receding diagonally back to the left, back to the right, and then also directly back, as if he's trying to develop some kind of atmosphere or some kind of perspective on these three different levels and layers. And this was something that we really didn't see until all the way back into the Roman and Greek period. And any time after that, it just kind of was forgotten and not focused on. So he's really interested in showing that. What's called foreshortening. Okay, and that's what's happening with the angels. And to spell that is Foreshortening. Foreshortening. Okay, and he's grouping them and clustering them like they did throughout the medieval period and the Byzantine and all the way back to antiquity, but he's not having them overlap and cluster because that makes them look even more flat. He's creating foreshortening. And then the landscape leads to the left focal point, which is Jesus himself in the bottom left. Like I talked about, everything is focused on him. So that's where the focal point is, you know, and it's balanced out by that tree that's up there on the cliffside. It's very dramatic. This is something that's coming from the medieval Gothic period, having more drama, having more emotion, so that you're connected to the stories on a more emotional, humanistic level. Yeah, and then he's starting to create what's called the play of light and shade. And the word that we're going to talk about even more thoroughly in the next chapter, in Art History 142, is what's called chiaroscuro. And it's a play between light and dark to show more volume and definition of figure. And you can see it in the clothing and in the drapery. You can see where it's a darker hue of color and it's a lighter hue of the same color. That's called chiaroscuro. And we spell that Chiarosuro. And it's an Italian word. And the chiaroscuro is just a play between the contrasting light colors and hues and the dark colors and hues. Okay, so again, trying to find perspective and depth based off of these value shifts in coloration. So this is going to be a new advent that's going to carry on for hundreds, all the way up until today, actually. All right, so I'll leave it at that whenever it comes to Giotto. Let's see what kind of time we have. Okay, good. Well, that's a very, very important piece. It's kind of the, Giotto's Arena Chapel is the pivotal piece from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So it's very important to know this and to see how things are moving away from the flatness of the medieval period and more into this more perspective and development and observation of actual natural occurrences. So using nature and compounding it with these spiritual stories coming from the Bible. I do want to look at real quick the Orvieto Cathedral, which is figure 14.3. And one thing that I want to mention about this is the advent of painting mixed with sculpture and architecture. This is like all of it, all right? It's very Gothic, so it has your high ornamentation and a high facade whenever it comes to the cathedral itself. You can see the jamb there in the bottom center, and then adjacent to that are two more jambs. The use of the stained glass with the rose window there in the top in the center. So it has all these major Gothic components to it. But one thing that's really interesting about this is that there are paintings on the surface of the architecture, almost like big billboards, if you will, of these biblical stories. And it's a mixture of carved relief with the painted depictions coming from the Bible, and it embraces the Gothic style, unlike a lot of the Italian counterparts at this time. So all the new cathedrals that are slowly being built during this time don't embrace as many of these Gothic techniques, at least in Italy. They are up in Europe, but here in Italy not as much. So it's very interesting to see how this is happening in Italy, and then all the counterparts, at least with architecture, are becoming more of the basilica-like shapes that we'll talk about whenever we get into the latter chapters in Art History 142. But do see how the Gothic is still finding its presence. But what's really unique about this cathedral is, again, that painted surface in combination with the relief carving that's occurring in the jamb and also above the jamb and around the perimeter of the rose stained glass window. That's that little circle right in the middle of the facade or in the front. Okay. And now we're going to take a look at Lorenzetti's frescoes. Now, real quick, frescoes, and this is going to be figure 14.17. To start, frescoes are a new invention as well, and what it is there's two different types of frescoes. There's the one fresco, which is the primary, and that's when you lay out plaster, and then as it's drying a little bit, you start to paint using a mixture of tempera and later on oils. And what's going to happen as you're painting and it's drying, it's going to create a chemical bond with the pigments in that tempera paint. At this time, it's going to be more tempera paint, and then it's going to become an oil paint and a mixture of the two. And it creates a chemical bond and crystallizes the surface and gives an illuminating glow off of the front of that painting, which is what the Sistine Chapel is with Michelangelo. It's this fresco painting. So this is going to be new. This is going to be a new technique, and Lorenzetti as well as Giotto are using. So the Arena Chapel was fresco as well. And then what's called secco fresco, which is S-E-C-C-O, that's when the plaster is already dried completely, and then you come in and paint on top. And it's not as withstanding. It doesn't last as long. For example, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is a secco fresco. That means he let the plaster dry, then he mixed tempera paint and oil paint together and did The Last Supper. But it's in awful condition because it's that secondary fresco technique. Versus Lorenzetti and Giotto, they are the first, or the one, B-U-E-N fresco, the first type of fresco. All right, that means that it's been painted when the plaster wasn't fully dry yet, and it allowed it to lock in and grab onto that pigment. Okay, so we're going to have two different scenes. We're going to have a peaceful city, and we're going to have a peaceful country. All right, and the reason that we're seeing these peaceful things is that there are battles, there are skirmishes, there are wars going on, and conflict, but at the same time, commerce and trade is looking pretty good right now. And it's no longer about kingdom versus kingdom. It's now becoming, the kingdoms are still there, but it's becoming more of a using commerce and trade as a way of developing competition and not battle upon battle. So it's really important to know that these images of peaceful city and peaceful country are a reflection of this kind of commerce. And again, with Lorenzetti's frescoes, is they're going to be like this fourth style Roman painting that we saw all the way back in chapter 7. And to see that is figure 14.17a. And you can see how it's laid out inside of this plaza, and how the paintings are lined up very similar to that fourth style painting. So let me give you a little bit of background on this and give you an idea of the context behind these paintings. So it's an allegory of peace even when violent party struggles were really happening. So it's kind of like this, like I said, this superficial presence of things are still progressing even though that there's battles and struggles between people. So he's depicting dancing, trading, rapid wealth and growth with what's called a panoramic perspective in architecture. So you think about whenever there's a, and this is what Peaceful City, whenever you use your camera to do a panoramic, shot, whenever you use your iPhones, it will start with one and then end over here, and then if it's not clean and crisp, it can kind of get delayed and be chopped up digitally. And if you remember how panoramic shots used to be, it looks like it's a picture that's being taken on a dome, like a glass dome. It bends on the sides, just like our eyes, our vision bends, but our cones and rods correct that bend in our vision. But naturally, our eyes do see a bend on both sides of our visual spectrum. So that's panoramic. So what he's using is that in the architecture. So you can see the architecture is all kind of, looks disjointed, but it's actually moving at angles and different points of connection in the background, like imaginary lines leading to what's called a vanishing point or a focal point. But on the ends of the composition, it's bent, so it looks a little disjointed. But it's intentional, and again, we call that the panoramic perspective. Panoramic perspective. So just think of your iPhones and the panoramic option that you have on your iPhones to kind of best explain how he's developing this scene. All right. So that's the Peaceful City. We see how it's fourth style type of painting from Rome with figure 14.17a. And then we'll conclude with a peaceful country. And again, he's trying to show that all these acts of peace that are going on right now with trade and commerce, which is actually a precursor to truly peaceful times that are going to happen during the Renaissance. And there's going to be more camaraderie and more attention to healthy competition. Versus here, he's trying to slowly depict it almost like a futuristic way of this is what it's going to be like. But right now there are skirmishes and fights between like princely courts and different small kingdoms throughout Europe and down into Italy and over into the Middle East, and all that is occurring right now. But he's trying to keep this kind of veneer or this like happy smile on all the time, and that's what these peaceful country fresco and peaceful city frescoes are about. It's like keeping that smile on the surface even though things are really tough. A different type of perspective is used here though. So it's not a panoramic perspective with peaceful country, it's an aerial perspective, or we could call it bird's eye view. And aerial is A-R-I-E-L perspective. So kind of seeing things like an eye, a hawk eye looking down on the scene, or an eagle's eye looking down on the scene, and how it's more of a vertical perspective looking down versus in a panoramic perspective it's more of a horizontal bend of the eye. This is more of a vertical bend of the eye, more aerial, like you're looking out of an airplane. And the allegory here is not one specific day, but an overall mood. So it is kind of broken up into different activities throughout the composition that doesn't necessarily depict one day of activity. It's like multiple different scenes, and that's going to be huge whenever it comes to the proto-Renaissance or the pre-Renaissance period, because there's going to be some very important artists that play on multiple stories happening within one painting, and kind of breaking up this time frame and using implied time to show to the left is one action, like for example here, the horseman riding down the hill, and then another activity in the middle, and then another activity to the right. So it's three different stages that may not have happened at one time on one day, but more about a mood of what was happening overall during this time. And again, this is one of the first landscape paintings since antiquity. So the landscape painting and the atmospheric painting is starting to come back, and it's something that we didn't see all the way to back the Greek-Roman times. So it's coming back, and Leonardo da Vinci is going to do landscape paintings, Raphael is going to do landscape paintings, Michelangelo is going to do landscape paintings, Donatello, all of these individuals are going to start to do these major type of atmospheric bird's eye view, like environments that correspond correspond with a certain individual or group of individuals in that landscape. So it's going to be a really big deal. All right, so I'll leave you with that. That's the end of chapter 14, and then from here we'll start getting into different areas of the world, different pockets of the world, to see what's happening in those areas whenever it comes to the finer arts being developed. All right, I'll leave you there. Take care.